All right. So, good morning. I'm talking to you today from Wadawurrung country on the coastline of Western Victoria. These are unceded Aboriginal lands, and I pay my respects to their elders. So, as we begin this lovely day of sharing and talking and listening, I'd like to invite you all to just close your eyes for a moment and come into the present moment. So try to leave behind all the preparation that brought you here, all the bustling and getting ready for the day. And with your eyes closed, I invite you to visualize an image of care, whatever care means to you. It might be a person who cares for you, or it might be someone or something that you care for. And while you hold that care in your mind, I'd just like you to notice the emotions that it generates and the feelings that it generates in your body. Now open your eyes and let's try to stay in that emotional space of care as we begin our day together. And as you'll see, my talk is an invitation to explicitly prioritise and value care. I'm a contemporary historian, which basically means that my work focuses on the recent past and how it lives on in the present. And I'm also an oral historian, so I do qualitative research. I interview people about their experiences of the past. Today I'm going to talk about how labour and care have intersected in the lives of Australian mothers, both before and during COVID, and then explore what these findings might mean for the next generation of Australian mothers. So my talk's going to range across the past, the present and the future. I'm right now coming to the end of a 6-year project on the history of Australian motherhood, conducted alongside my own mothering. So I'll be drawing partly upon those interviews. And I've also done some recent research on the impacts of COVID on academic mothers. And also I've begun pilot research on the experiences of Australian parents during times of environmental crisis. So I'll be ranging across all of those bits of qualitative research in my talk today. But first I want to just talk briefly about how we might define some of these key terms that we're using in the symposium today. In defining what a mother is, we might equally ask, why not use the term parent? And I prefer the term motherhood, and I'm going to explain why. For me, mother isn't necessarily a term relating to a sexed biological body, though it has been for many cis women across the periods that I study. I agree with historian Sarah Knott that mother is first and foremost a verb. Mothers can be defined and understood most meaningfully through their labours. And the act of caring for a child, particularly as a primary caregiver, is what most typifies the role of mother. Feminist philosopher Sarah Ruddock used the term maternal thinking to refer to a special quality of thinking, an ethical mode of relating to the world with care. And for Ruddock, maternal thinking is not innate, instinctive, or rooted in biology, but rather learnt through the repetitive care of vulnerable, dependent children. So it's through practice that this relational mode of thinking and being arises. So Ruddock believed it's not only women who mother, though in industrialised patriarchal societies it often is. So following Ruddock and Knott, I take mother to be someone defined through a primary or significant caregiving role in relation to a child. And if we're thinking about definitions of labour, I think for me, the term has a connotation of struggle and toil. It's not usually pleasurable or easy, it's usually hard work. The term labour is also obviously applied to the work of childbirth, the most strenuous of labours required to bring new life into the world. But feminists began to define the concept of reproductive labour from the 70s, most noticeably through the Wages for Housework campaign. And the movement sought to emphasise that female domestic work is often unpaid and underappreciated, and also that paid work within capitalist societies depends upon that unpaid labour. But the primary association with labour in public discourse has been paid work, and we see that in economic discussions where we usually refer to labour force participation. So in the title of my talk today, I've tried to sort of play with the idea of another form of unpaid labour, a labour of love. And I want to sort of playfully undermine the idea that labour and care are oppositional and distinguished by whether they're paid or unpaid. So mothering as a verb is a practice that's both hard work, but also emotionally resonant. It's physical, demanding, and definitely tiring, but it's also inherently rewarding because it's oriented towards preservation and growth. both of a child, but also of the relationship between mother and child. And care, like labour, can be a form of work, but it has more gentle connotations, and it's connected to words like nurture, cherish, sustain, and love. Care is strongly associated with unpaid labour in the home, but it also takes paid forms such as elder care and childcare. We know that care has been and continues to be feminised and marginalised. And whether paid or unpaid, care has often been underappreciated and undervalued. So in my talk today, I'd like to emphasise the care part of the symposium title. I'd like us to think about what enables mothers to perform their roles as carers as much as what supports them to perform their roles as labourers. And one of the main aims of the women's liberation movement was to sever women's biological connection to care and to free women from domestic drudgery to labour in the public sphere for their own self-actualisation. But I think one of the limitations of this aspiration is it collapses all of the domestic work, like keeping house, under the same heading as the care of children. And to my mind, there's a world of difference in emotional significance between cleaning floors and reading bedtime stories. The goal of much of our government policy over the last 30 years or so has been to outsource care so that mothers can do more labour. But I question in my talk today whether this policy objective fully responds to the needs and desires of mothers, and also whether this is perhaps the best way to support families as we move into an uncertain and dynamic future. So my research is focused on listening closely to what mothers say that they need and want. And so I'm going to turn now to consider what mothers told me about the intermingling of labour and care in their lives before COVID in the early parts of the 21st century. So my research has looked at the history of Australian motherhood since 1945 through oral history interviews with a diverse cohort, and I call them maternographies. They are specifically focused on mothering, but within the broad context of a woman's life story. And over this 75-year period that I've studied, there's been some broad and easily discernible trends. There's been a shift in the intermingling of labour and care in Australian mothers' lives. We see maternal workforce participation growing significantly, and many women having fewer children later in life. At the same time, the numbers of women choosing not to have children have risen steadily. So taken together, I think these shifts demonstrate a change in our understanding of female identity and the locus of female identity, where motherhood's become less central and all-consuming and work has grown in significance. And this is relatively well understood, but through interviewing mothers, I've come to realise that their needs and desires are a bit more complex than this. Ariana is an Anglo-Australian mother who was raised by a single mother, works as a marketing manager, and had the first of 3 children in 2010. And in our interview together, she described the naivety of her prematernal expectations of how she thought mothering and work would combine in her life. She explained to me that the reality was much more difficult.
I reckon being a working mum is really, well, in my experience in a corporate environment, is really difficult. So I think it's difficult on so many levels and for so many different reasons. And I've said this to Rob, I'm the one that has to have all the awkward conversations with my boss. I'm the one that has to announce every time that I'm pregnant. And I'm the one that knows what the fallout from that is. And you care about your job, but you also care about having a family. And you shouldn't have to choose which one you care more about, but it's like people expect you to. And I have always felt like I have to give 110% to demonstrate that I am committed to the job and doing a good job, even though I'm a mum. And I'm really careful not to tell too many stories about my kids and all those kind of things at work. I think motherhood's changed me in that way, in that I'm always kind of trying to probably prove myself a little bit more, because I want to make sure that they know that I'm I'm still good enough at what I do, or I'm still as good, or I'm getting better despite having children.
So Ariana explains that she feels that her workplace expects her to prioritise labour over care, and the result is that she consciously censors or obscures her maternal identity around colleagues, and she's internalised a pressure to work doubly as hard to prove that she's still capable and committed. Since having her third child in 2016, these pressures have only increased, and she told me that she yearns for a different balance between the elements in her life, but she can't imagine how it's achievable. Descriptions like Ariana's seem to confirm what American psychoanalyst Daphne de Marneff calls maternal desire. She argues that contemporary American women feel that they cannot acknowledge their desire to have children and their desire to care for and spend time with their children. One of the ambivalent outcomes of second wave feminism is that maternal desire has become close to unspeakable in the 21st century. Similar themes have reverberated through many of the maternographies that I've co-created with recent mothers. Time and again, contemporary Australian mothers have expressed shock or surprise at the strength of their maternal desire and the way it destabilised their prematernal expectations of how they would combine labour and care after having children. Michelle was born in Mozambique to parents of Dutch and Indonesian backgrounds and moved to Australia as a child. She's in a heterosexual relationship, works for a hairdressing salon, and had the first of 2 children in 2013. Before becoming a mother, she told me that she planned to return to work 3 days a week when her baby was 3 months old. After having her baby, she adapted those plans to 2 days a week when her baby was 6 months old. But our interview was conducted just before Michelle returned to work, when all the ambivalence of that transition was uppermost in her mind.
How are you feeling about going back to work and Frankie going to childcare and stuff?
Mixed emotions. I'm glad it's only 2 days, and I'm glad the days are spread out. They're not consecutive days, so it's a Monday and a Friday, so I can, get my work fix and then have a Frankie fix over the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. When I spent the day with, because I did orientation there, you don't do the usual things that you would do with her here. They're working, they're looking after children, they're feeding them. They're not really doing amazing interactive sort of programs or anything like that. They just sort of keep them entertained to a minimum, which I sort of feel a bit, Frankie deserves more than that. But then again, it is only 2 days a week. And I guess it's kind of good for her in a way. I mean, it's probably better that I would look after her at home, but realistically I'd like to go back to work. Money wise we sort of need to as well. So yeah, mixed emotions, totally. Like, I thought it would be a lot easier than what it is. I thought it would be, I'll drop her off, I'll get my fix at work and I'll be fine and she'll be fine. But I know that tomorrow, my dry run, it's going to be difficult anyway, Just actually physically saying goodbye and leaving her there is going to be hard.
So Michelle's maternography is a poignant example of how maternal desire can disrupt plans for returning to paid work after having children. But if becoming a mother can disrupt a woman's career plans, it can also enhance her abilities in the workforce. Heather was raised by Anglo-Australian adoptive parents, and as an adult she's worked in the creative arts. She had the first of 4 children with her wife in 2012, and the couple have taken turns carrying pregnancies. Heather initially felt very conscious of the negative impacts of mothering upon her employment, but her view about that has changed over time.
Just a sense of kindness and care and things that I'd always had, but was sort of, it was bigger, and I listened more and sort of found myself watching and listening a lot. And I feel like that came from that early motherhood of learning to kind of listen to cues, and that I actually found early motherhood, I remember feeling it like it was a really big creative act, as in all of the principles that, I sort of engaged in artistically and creatively in my work came to the fore so much about instinct and the unconscious, and all of those things really.
I think Heather's descriptions of how mothering changed her are reminiscent of Ruddock's arguments about maternal thinking. She can acknowledge that mothering has changed her relationship to her work, but in ways that she can see are beneficial. Nevertheless, I think the idea that motherhood can enhance a woman's labour force capabilities are not widely shared in contemporary Australia, with many employers continuing to see motherhood as limiting a woman's potential. Overall, my interviews with 21st century Australian mothers before COVID suggest that what mothers want is much more complex than just workforce participation. They want labour and care. They want to feel satisfied that when they labour, their children are meaningfully cared for, and that the expertise and skills they develop through care are recognised and valued in the workforce and broader society. Many contemporary mothers feel that they're caught in a hopeless predicament. They want satisfying careers and to spend time caring for their children, and they feel frustrated that it's so hard to devote themselves to both aims in contemporary Australia. So if before 2020 Australian mothers felt a maelstrom of conflicting emotions around labour and care, what has pandemic life done to their situation? I think COVID has shaken up long rigidified structures of labour and care, particularly in states like Victoria and New South Wales that have experienced prolonged lockdowns. There have been both alarming challenges and surprising gains. Quantitative research has shown that while the unpaid work of childcare and domestic tasks has increased for all parents, it has most significantly increased for mothers. There's an overwhelming sense of stress and exhaustion in households with children. Some Australian families have experienced job losses and financial strain, and there have been widespread fears for the safety of mothers and children experiencing family violence. But there have also been some benefits. For white-collar workers for whom it's possible to work from home, having parents at home has cut down on time wasted in commuting. In families with two parents, having both parents at home can result in more equitable divisions of labour. Some mothers told me that they feel the hectic pace of 21st century life has slowed down. With the pressure of after-school and weekend activities for children removed, there's been more space in the week. And some children with additional needs have flourished, spending more time at home with parents, while for others vital supports have been harder to access. But perhaps the most significant but also intangible shift has been that it's much harder for mothers to hide their child-rearing responsibilities, as Ariana described herself doing before COVID. With avenues for outsourced care diminished, mothers have had to admit that they care for children. And for those working from home, children have been literally visibilised as they flitted around the background of our Zoom screens. Petronella was born in Poland, raised partially by her grandmother, and moved to Australia at 8 years of age. She had her first child in 2017 and her second child in May 2020 during the first COVID outbreak. So she's experienced having a new baby both before and during the pandemic, and we've done interviews after each. She feels that on balance there were slightly more pros than cons to her of having a child during COVID.
You know, Carla, sometimes I feel like I personally brought upon this pandemic on the world because I just wanted to hang out at home all year with my baby without FOMO and to actually just work from home with my feet up while I was still pregnant and not have to actually ask for special consideration. And that's what happened. So throughout April, yeah, because I worked till 39 weeks, which is dumb, but again, part of that sort of guilt combined with actually really loving my job. Anyway, so I was working till 39 weeks, and it was just so fantastic to have those last 4 weeks. I think it was 4 weeks under lockdown. I could just sit at home. It was brilliant.
Petronella conveyed something that other pandemic mothers have expressed to me, that COVID forced everyone to slow down their daily activities and retreat to the domestic sphere in a manner that mimics the common pattern of new mothers. While many pandemic mothers missed the support of extended family, those in relationships appreciated the fact that partners were more likely to be working from home and the experience of caring for a newborn was more shared from the beginning. Sophia is an Indigenous woman who works in higher education and had the first of 2 children with a heterosexual partner in 2013. She told me in material gathered via written communications via email, she told me that she found some positives in working from home during lockdown, particularly that remote commuting gave her 2 full hours, that removing commuting from her day gave her 2 full hours back in her day. But there were also many challenges in her family. The care loads have increased, both in terms of managed transitions between school and remote learning, and also the extra emotional care that her children have needed during a pandemic. And while she and her partner have tried to apportion their care loads equally, she found that they no longer had the time and energy to work against a gender division of labour in the home. So what do we hear in these narratives of mothering before and after COVID? I think we can see that there were already tensions and ambivalences in maternal narratives. For women who've grown up after second wave feminism, assuming that work will be a central part of their lives, the strength of maternal desire is something they often don't anticipate. And I think the COVID pandemic has added another layer of this to this complexity. Becoming a mother is a significant psychological transformation and cultural transition, and Australian mothers were often already inadequately supported through this transition. COVID's highlighted the extent to which new motherhood is privatised and confined to the family and the home. And while there have been some gains, largely it has exacerbated the inadequacy of social supports. Mothers have been under more strain than ever before, and the impossibility of satisfying expectations in the labour market and expectations around care have become more apparent. And generally, mothers have told me that they've tried to cope in the short term by sacrificing care of the self. Things like sleep, exercise, recreation, or socialising have fallen by the wayside as mothers have scrambled to just get by. And so I think these themes have to some extent been acknowledged in public discussions around pandemic impacts, but what I think has not been adequately addressed is that family life is not returning to a pre-COVID normal next year. And this is because COVID's not solely a public health crisis, though that's where our immediate efforts have had to focus. COVID's also an ecological crisis as surely as disasters as like storms or fires. It's an environmental crisis in the sense that it's symptomatic of an unsustainable human relationship with nature. In this case, our encroachment upon wild areas. And so just as we know that climate change is leading to more frequent and more intense disasters, scientists have also warned that further pandemics are likely as viruses cross over from animal species. So to me, these crises are all symptomatic of the Anthropocene, the geological epoch in which humans exert a greater influence upon the natural world than other forces. I don't think we can any longer afford to view these environmental crises as temporary ruptures before a return to normality. And just as Australian mothers have lived through the extremes of Black Summer, followed by the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic, so too parenting through crisis is becoming a new normal. So the basis of my latest research is the contention that we're entering a new era in the history of the family. I call this parenthood in the Anthropocene. Anthropocenic motherhood is characterised by the normalisation of crisis and the requirement that mothers adopt a new repertoire of child-rearing abilities, the ability to support children through recurrent crises and to raise them with the skills to live on a warming planet. Stories from mothers living through the Black Summer bushfires give us some clues to what this emerging new form of caring for children feels like. Amelia was born in Bulgaria and moved to Australia at the age of 3. She became pregnant for the first time in November 2019 during the Black Summer fires. She was living in Canberra, which was surrounded by fires, and she recalled that the smoke haze began in late December and continued to the end of February. Amelia was very worried about the potential effects of smoke inhalation on her unborn child, and she felt that medical advice was limited and vague. She began working from home quite early in her pregnancy to avoid the smoke, and she bought air purifiers and masks, but was still monitoring air pollution and making daily decisions about whether to go outside. In desperation, she went and stayed with family in Adelaide, where the smoke haze was less severe and she could spend some time outdoors. But the fires and then COVID have cast a pall over her pregnancy and meant that she's had an additional layer of worry on top of the regular concerns of the expectant mother.
There was definitely many moments, particularly through the bushfires, where I thought, wow, I'm pregnant now. Like, is this going to be a reality for my child when they get older? Like, are these things going to become more frequent? And I guess similarly with the pandemic, you know, you think, oh, is this a safe place for my child to come into the world? There's
Anna was more directly impacted by the Black Summer fires. She grew up in an Anglo-Australian family in regional Victoria, and she's worked in healthcare as an adult. She had her first child in 2016. She was staying in Malakuta, which is her husband's hometown, when a firestorm descended on the coastal community. They were fortunate to flee into New South Wales and find a motel to shelter in, but new family and friends were directly in the path of the firestorm and were stranded in caravan parks and in boats offshore. I asked Anna what it was like experiencing a bushfire while looking after her child.
Yeah, it was really stressful. I think I remember just being in a state of kind of panic the whole time, and just on edge in that kind of fight or flight mode for a good 48 hours. Otto was obviously, I think I was lucky because he was just at that age where he didn't pick up on anything. So it was easy just to have him in the motel room, and he wasn't phased that he wasn't leaving and stuff. He probably couldn't pick up on how stressed out we might have been. So but and all I just kept thinking about was that we were lucky. We were so lucky that we had a house to be, a motel room. Not like, I just couldn't stop thinking about everyone else that was all these poor people that were kind of stuck in the caravan park, and what they were being told was about to happen, and how terrifying and how much of an impact that was going to have on all those kids and families, and just how horrible. Like, they were being told that the fires were just going to make a wall of water around them to save them, and stuff like that. It was just and hearing our friends on boats, and just trying to it was very, I suppose I was just so stressed out about what everyone else was going through, because we were very safe, I think. So
While mothers have always had to raise and protect their children during times of crisis, what I think is different now is that the frequency, duration and severity of environmentally linked crises is increasing. So the hypothesis I'm testing with my latest research is that the accumulation of these experiences is shifting our cultural understandings of motherhood and of parenthood and family more broadly. And if I'm correct that we're entering a new era in family relations, I think it's vitally important that we fully understand the experiences of mothers in these times if we're to design policies and supports that cater to their changing needs. We need policies that are not just reactive in times of explicit disaster, but also proactive, recognising that these are disastrous times. In the past, much Australian family policy has focused on productivity. In particular, government policies concerning childcare, parental leave and taxation have prioritised maternal workforce participation as an unexamined good. But what would family policy look like that aimed not just at productivity but also well-being of parents and their children? I think fostering well-being will take more care and nurturance in an era of disasters. And we know this from seeing the mental health impacts of COVID and also the post-traumatic stress that often follows disasters. I think a new emphasis on care is needed in this catastrophic era. And I also think we need to care for carers, particularly in flashpoints of crisis. But I recognise that talking about apocalyptic futures is difficult and can feel bleak, particularly at the end of a year when we're all so tired. So I'd like to leave you with some hopeful ideas that others have given me. When I discussed my research on anthropocenic parenthood with Indigenous colleagues, they've gently reminded me that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have already lived through the cultural and environmental apocalypse of colonisation and survived. In the words of Native American philosopher Kyle Powers White, the Anthropocene is colonial déjà vu. For some, this era of crisis is not unprecedented, and their determination to endure predates the environmental crises of the 21st century. And I've also taken comfort from wise things that interviewees have shared with me as they talk about how they keep caring even in challenging times. Petronella, who you heard from earlier, had some thoughts about what guides her when I raise these questions with her.
We speak a lot about like intergenerational trauma. So this idea that the trauma experienced by our grandparents and great-grandparents, either as individuals or as a generation, can kind of reverberate down to us and then onto our children. But I think there's probably something like intergenerational resilience as well. My my family's Polish. My maternal grandmother was born in 1920 to, like quite a wealthy, well-to-do family. And when she was 19, World War II broke out. The family lost everything. And she's suddenly gone from being this quite sort of privileged position to having her world upended and having to, make do with no money and with sort of this political oppression and whatnot. And somehow she thrived within that. And more importantly than just surviving and thriving, she always she was just never bitter. And then I think back to my parents, and when I was born in 1981, months after I was born, Poland was put under martial law. And I sort of think, like, far out, that must have been scary with the newborn. Again, we've been complaining about all the misinformation of the government and the constantly changing rules. Like, when I was 4, Chernobyl blew up and all of the children of Eastern Europe had to be taken to be given iodine. And wow, my parents must have been terrified by the lack of government information, the thinking back on that gives me personally a lot of like comfort and reassurance that I can deal with this.
For Petronella, her family relationships and the legacy of her parents and grandmother give her hope to believe in intergenerational resilience. So I wonder if we can foster such reserves into our children born in the Anthropocene. I think renewed and strengthened parental care will be vital to nurturing intergenerational resilience. And I think we need to insist upon the value of care in times of uncertainty, to consciously and lovingly nurture extraordinary reserves of fortitude. So what I'm ultimately arguing is that in disastrous times, maternal care is needed more than ever. And the kinds of research we do in listening to and amplifying maternal voices is utterly critical if we're to meaningfully care for carers through this century of upheaval. Thank you.